Hello and good evening. This is Jeffrey Tucker of Liberty.me. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope my sound is good. If it's not, just let me know in the text box. It's a live recording, so I'll be taking your questions, possibly, if I can get over to the area. I promised tonight we would talk about Islam, and that is, in fact, what we're going to talk about. And the reason for that, this is a series that goes through classic books in the libertarian tradition. This week's book is The Discovery of Freedom by Rose Wilder Lane, written in, I believe, the mid-1940s, 1944, something like 45. In wartime, by one of the great journalists of, I guess some people would call it the old right. I would just call her a great interwar period American individualist, Rose Wilder Lane. She's sometimes credited as the ghostwriter, at least very much so the editor of the Little House books, which were signed by her mother, and then also a great author herself, and a great theorist, actually. And this book is her wonderful work of theory. I said in the introduction to this book that the first time I read it, I thought, well, I already know this stuff already. Yeah, freedom's great. I think I get it. But then I reread it and found that it's actually more substantive than I remembered, with a lot of very interesting history and an overarching theory. And the third time I read it, I was actually blown away. I thought, Rose Wilder Lane has hit upon the crucial truth of all of human history, which is that humanity flourishes better in absence of large-scale authorities telling people what to do, and just organizing themselves spontaneously as a way of unleashing human energy, creativity, creating the global division of labor, creating an unpredictable world of experimentation, of trial and error. So she describes history as essentially a long struggle against authority. Now, why doesn't she say a struggle against the state? Now, obviously, the state is the worst authority, but in her way of thinking, there are other forms of authority, and any attempt to form these authorities are dangerous. She would include in here probably, large-scale corporations, especially, and to the extent that they rely on government support, churches. Actually, the large-scale churches that attempt to substitute for governments in people's lives. For her, the struggle for liberty was really a struggle against these kind of top-down authoritarian institutions of all sorts, the worst of which is government. But government just doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from ideology. And it's the ideology that believes that the world has to be planned, that there has to be a kind of designer to cause everybody to behave in a certain way, to enable outcomes to happen, to create social structures and to create cultures. And this is what she thinks is the grave conceit. It never works, and it always sets us back by re-enslaving our minds, by diminishing opportunities for human cooperation, and for generally creating a kind of a stasis, the presumption that we know how the world's supposed to work and we're going to impose it from above is contrary to her notion of what constitutes individual freedom. So that's what this whole book is about. It's about the unleashing of human energy through the spirit of individualism and anarchism, so to speak. But what might surprise you, and in some ways it remains one of the most notable aspects of this book, and the one that used to be commented about, maybe in the 1950s and the 1960s, but which isn't hardly commented on today at all, mainly because the book is not well read, The Discovery of Freedom, is the chapter on Islam. So I reread that in preparation for this lecture, for obvious reasons. We are living, my friends, in a period of the massive demonization of Islam. Islam is by itself considered to be the great enemy, the great enemy to defeat, the great enemy of human liberation around the world. yes, our elites tell us that it's all about ISIS, that it's only the violent portions of Islam. But if you look on the internet, you'll see that actually very quickly, in a matter of years, essentially since when? Since over the last 15 years, we've seen the attacks on Islam as a religion intensify, and you don't have to get very far in your Facebook feed before you bump into somebody giving you a link about how violence is an inherent part of the Islamic faith. That Muslims, we've always been at war, with Islam. That if you only need to look at the Quran and see that this is a religion of violence, that lives off violence, that promotes violence. And there'll always and everywhere be a struggle between the Christian West and Islam. And that is the decisive struggle into which our historical epoch has plunged us. And so we read this. Now, what can I say? I feel a little bit of detachment from this ideological trajectory that people seem to be on. And it's not because I think Islam is the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity. But, in times like this, it's very good to have a kind of corrective. So I grew up in the midst of the Cold War. So I have too great a memory, actually. It's a lot easier to be young and naive and, born after 9/11 and have come about in a world where there was never any other struggle besides Islam. U.S. versus Islamic fundamentalism. But actually, there's always a struggle of some sort. And it only takes a little bit of history to understand that. The military-industrial congressional complex, the military apparatus, the history's largest by far, can't survive without a good, solid rationale for its existence. I remember the waning days of the Cold War. There was something of a panic on after the Soviet Union just sort of collapsed unceremoniously and without any kind of plan or announcement. Suddenly there was a sense of, oh no, who's going to be the new enemy? Or else we're going to have to get our peace dividend. The military is going to be unraveled, and we'll lose a rationale for having troops all over the world, and that sort of thing. We had to have some basis for American imperialism, for the preservation of this gigantic apparatus of military funding, private contractors that are weapons builders, congressional payoffs and political payoffs that are tied to the military state. All of this just can't be unplugged all overnight. I mean, there's a glorious moment in 1989. Suddenly it seemed like normalcy could break out. Up until that time in history, for 40 years, every military conflict abroad, every delaying of freedom, every absence of normalcy, every new war was justified as the Great War on Communism, and in particular, war on Russia. Now, if you have a historical bent, you'll notice the irony to this, because this was this whole Cold War thing was born in the years following the Second World War. Yet another moment in history where we might have had peace. We might have seen the prevalence of normalcy. I mean, the country had suffered through a horrible planning program, the radical diminution of freedom, the draft, price controls, wage controls, rationing of food, censorship, privation and deprivation, and just general human suffering for the war effort went on and on for the whole of World War II. And then the war was ended. And there needed to be some basis for reviving this. Now, you'll recall that our valiant allies in the Second World War were of all people the Russians. They were and Stalin as its head, and FDR, and the famous picture of FDR and Stalin together, as the great champions of freedom. 1948 came, and out of nowhere, Russia went from being wonderful allies in the struggle for freedom around the world and the struggle against despotism to suddenly the new enemy that was supposedly behind the victory of the communists and Greece that were suddenly threatening, Eastern Europe, although Eastern Europe was given to the Soviets by FDR. And we saw just almost out of nowhere in 1948, a revival of the 1920s Red Scare. And everybody went from the 1920s, the Red Scare, is like, oh, the communists are everywhere. They're attacking us. They're trying to undermine our civilization. To practically overnight, no, the Russians are wonderful. They're great allies in the great struggle against the fascism of Germany, Italy, Axis powers, and Japan. So Russia was, had a respite in the demonization that went on. That was all revived suddenly in 1948 with the passage of the Marshall Plan and a new triangulating strategy by Truman to demonize Russia and put the Republicans in an awkward position of being an anti-Russia politician, the Democrats, after having allied with Russia in World War II, Roosevelt's Road to Russia and all that, which the right wing in America and the Republicans very much resented. Now we're in an awkward position of opposing Truman on his anti-Russia campaign in 1948. And it was on that basis, just this sort of almost overnight shift in who are the bad guys and who are the good guys. It's on that basis that George Orwell wrote his book 1984. A story about a government that controls people's minds through the demonization of foreign enemies. So we've always been allies with Eurasia. We've always been enemies with Eurasia. The line changes practically overnight. And governments can rely on people to be very short-sighted and have very short memories of what came before. And it's remarkable, just the way in which people can be so easily manipulated into focusing on a new enemy. I began to realize this first in the Cold War, in the latter period of the Cold War, and then even throughout the 90s, how a government can suddenly turn the spotlight on a single country and say, oh, look, here's a terrible, terrible evil going on. Forget the rest of the world. The rest of the world's at peace. Everybody's happy. Things are content. In this one country, terrible things are happening. This happened all the time during the Cold War. So suddenly, Salvador was, it's a hotbed of revolutionary radicalism, and people are suffering all over, and we must stop the suffering. Nicaragua, oh my goodness, the communists are taking over Nicaragua. We can't allow them to do that because they'll spread their virus throughout Central America. Then they'll be on our doorsteps, and there'll be a Red Dawn scenario, And it's actually amusing at some level because people didn't think about Nicaragua before, and they haven't thought about it since. But once the government's priorities change, Americans are so famously ignorant of geopolitics and don't know anything outside of their own really hometown or state. The country is for most Americans just a foreign place. So when you say, look, there's a demonic country in the South, named Nicaragua, and it's coming to get us, Americans are easily manipulated. And so the line can just change overnight. I mean, I've myself lived through many iterations of this. When Manuel Noriega went from being, a devil monster to being a great freedom fighter, and ally, to being once again a person who had to be overthrown, just because the line happened to change. Similar situation in Nicaragua, and the same situation in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, enjoyed several iterations of being, on one hand, a great ally in the war on terror, on the other hand, a sponsor of terror, and the line changes and people adapt to it. So I say all this as a way of giving you a heads up that, we live in a world of grave manipulation, and things are not always as they seem. And I would say the same is true with Islam today. So just a little bit of background. going back to the 1980s. Now we know what goes on in the right-wing blogosphere today. Islam is being pilloried as, inherently anti-Christian, bloodthirsty religion, people, desperate to die, for Allah, and so on. And most right-wing people today, manipulated by talk shows, radio shows, and their favorite right-wing personas out there, are glad to believe this, and scouring through the Quran and digging out passages of violence and so on, and throwing them in our faces. Well, it's been a very difficult thing for me to accept, because in my political memory, I remember a time when the line was exactly the opposite. So let me take you back to Afghanistan. Soviet invasion, 1997. Immediately, the U.S. starts funding the anti-Soviet opposition in Afghanistan, known as as the Mujahideen, which is a loose confederation of religious Islamic fundamentalists that were increasingly radicalized over the course of 10 years. And it became a doctrine within of Reagan foreign policy, that in order to actively, so previous doctrine had been to, contain the Soviet Union, Well, Reagan, under the Reagan administration, the doctrine changed. Now we were supposed to be rolling back Soviet communism. And the way to do this was not by putting troops on the ground, which would have been seen as like, complete act of war, but rather to fund the anti-Soviet opposition in a whole series of countries. So the Contras in Nicaragua, the government of El Salvador, Johannes Savimbi, and the African country, I can't even remember the name of it now. And in Afghanistan, this is particularly intense. So the Soviets, having a long occupation of Afghanistan, were opposed by the Mujahideen, and the U.S., sometimes overtly, most often covertly, began to fund the Mujahideen. And by 1985, 1986, it has become very intense and very overt, and very much part of sort of American right-wing ideology. Now, is it a problem that the Mujahideen were dedicated Islamic fundamentalists who wanted Sharia law and wanted to, impose it? But it wasn't even a consideration. Back in those days, all the main right-wing outlets, from Human Events to National Review, Pat Buchanan and George Shultz and Jean Kirkpatrick, and all the main purveyors of what came to be called the Reagan Doctrine, had become wildly pro-Islam. And this was being promoted in all the usual outlets for American conservatives, like pro-Islam, not just like, let's make a temporary alliance with Islam, but pro-Islam. So how did this go? Well, it went like this. And maybe you can still recognize remnants of this, because you bump into it from time to time out there, the sort of attitudes that are out there. The idea was this. The family and religion are the foundation of a good society. But there are secular elites out there that are mostly non-religious, even atheistic, that don't believe in these fundamental values like family and faith and tradition. And we have to stop them, because they're undermining everything that's great about civilization. And really, the battle lines, according to a 1980s style conservative, and we're talking about 1985, 1986, was not between freedom and violence, or between Islam and Christianity, but it was between communism on one hand and capitalism on the other, as it had been for 40 years. But on a different level, it was between the forces of secular liberalism on one hand, and the people of the book on the other hand, Judeo-Christian tradition. Of course, we know that phrase. but also more fundamentally Islam. Because why? Why is Islam supposed to be this wonderful ally in the great battle against secular liberalism? Because whatever you want to say about Islamic extremists and fundamentalists, they're not liberals in any sense, right? Not in the classical sense, not in the modern sense. They rejected liberalism. But for this, they were widely praised in the conservative press at the time. You're welcome to look this up. The whole white right-wing press was united in praise of the glorious, warlike, fundamental, hardcore values that Islam represented. What were those values? Pro-faith. People of the book, after all. They accepted the Old Testament. They accepted the teachings of Jesus, a long history of Islam in the West. In many ways, it contributed mightily to the development of the European spirit by preserving ancient texts in the 7th and 8th centuries. And they were reluctant to embrace the teachings of the egg-headed professoriate at Yale and Harvard, the secular intellectuals. So they rejected secularism, pro-family, pro-tradition, people of the book. And above all else, they, like us, hated communism. And in fact, whereas the Christian West is somewhat reluctant to use decisive force against communism because we're too squeamish, we're a little bit weak, we're too cautious as a people. These people, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were considered to be glorious because they were willing to fight for their beliefs. And shouldn't then we also support them in their great anti-communist struggle for faith and family with American tax dollars and weaponry? And so it was, and so it would be. Now, this is so intense, this sort of propaganda line from the right wing, that top commanders and leaders within the Mujahideen were brought over to the United States to speak very frequently at CPAC, Republican gatherings, luncheons on Capitol Hill. I myself, as a very naive young man, attended one of these luncheons. It was held by Howard Phillips, then head of the Conservative Caucus, who brought the top military commander in the Mujahideen over from Afghanistan. And I was riding up the elevator. I'll never forget it. I was riding up the elevator with this very tall, sort of frighteningly dressed man who seemed like one of the scariest people I had ever been in an elevator with. I'm a tolerant guy, whatever, trying to appreciate other cultures, but I mean, this guy sort of alarmed me. And I was amazed to see, once I sat down for the dinner, or for the luncheon, that this man I had ridden up in the elevator was in fact the luncheon speaker. And he got up and speaking in his native language, yelling and screaming about jihad and his fundamental, the values and why communism had to be overthrown in Afghanistan. And there was an interpreter there who would announce to the whole group after every sentence an interpretation. And if I remember correctly, he would say things like, well, General so-and-so says that he supports traditional family values. And then the guy would go on. And then he'd say, and resents communism for imposing, for taking away their faith and imposing liberalism on his wonderful country of rooted nomadic peoples who just want to preserve their way of life and not have to obey the teachings of Marx. And so on it went. I mean, you'd swear, based on the translator's iteration of the speech, that this guy had basically adhered to the Republican Party platform in every respect. And so it was, and it never stopped for years and years, this kind of pro-Islamic propaganda. It was almost like required belief among the conservative establishment, especially among the conservative ideologues, support Islam. They're people of the book. They're people of faith. They're united with us in our struggle against secular liberalism. They're pro-family. They won't have their traditional beliefs undermined by secular liberal powers attempting to rob them of their rightful heritage and loyalties. And so on it went. And you can see, as I'm explaining that this way, how it is that conservatives would buy into this, completely. And so they did. There was no war on Islam. It was exactly the opposite. There was nobody warning in those days that Islam is fundamentally opposed to Christianity. Exactly the contrary. It was that we Christians, Islam, are united and as partners in the great struggle against our common foe, professors at Harvard, the media elite, communists, secular liberals, and so on. So you see, this is the world I actually remember. I mean, it's happened in my lifetime. So it's very difficult for me to take too seriously the swing that's happened in the other direction, especially since 9/11. Now, you could say, well, in the old days, people were naive about what Islam represents, and maybe there's a certain truth to that, and I'm not here to deny that Islamic fanaticism is a terrible problem. I mean, it is. It's reached crisis levels for the entire region. But I'm only drawing attention to the danger of being manipulated by the latest propaganda from Washington and from fixers who can change on a dime. And that's indeed what had happened. And it's just like Orwell. It's like, we've always been friends with Islam. And then, a few years later, suddenly it's like, we've always been enemies with Islam. They've always been our enemy. There's a perpetual struggle between Islam and Christianity. So I'm skeptical of these kind of sweeping claims and alert to the fact that there's manipulation going on. And this is where I think you can gain some real benefit from Rose Wilder Lane, because she has this chapter in here where she re-renders the contribution of the prophet as being a valiant victory for human liberty, an attempt to free humanity from bondage. And the story is not impossible to understand once you read it. I would encourage you to read the entire chapter. It's quite remarkable. One of the most Islamophilic, I guess you could say, writings in the history of 20th century literature, actually. I mean, it's quite remarkable. But she tells the story of, after the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Catholic Church, which attempted to reproduce Roman-style government, with a new Caesar in the form of the Pope, top-down rule, rule by the sword. She sees that as having undermined the great message of Jesus, which was all about peace and persuasion and voluntarism. And she saw an imperial Catholic Church rising up in a ruined civilization after the fall of Rome to take the place of the old Roman state, to continue to control and impose authority and oppress. So she saw the coming of the prophet Muhammad as being an attempt to liberate people from essentially this false choice. Neither government nor church needs to rule the world, but instead, human beings need to be directly responsible to God. And saw his triumph as really a victory for liberty. And she carries this story out to the extreme. A few words, for example, about the Quran and its relationship to violence in the human conscience. If you're going to put all the passages in the Quran that could be interpreted as being endorsing violence against all the passages in Christianity and the Christian scriptures that seem to be endorsing violence, there would be no comparison. You know, between the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, there's every justification for using violence in defense of the faith, and we know this. They've all been invoked. I mean, the Bible has been invoked on behalf of the Inquisition, on behalf of slavery, on behalf of every kind of imperial crusade you can possibly ever imagine, from the first Crusades into the New World by Spain, all the way into World War I and even the Iraq War. You know, so these passages are not innocuous. And similarly, the Quran has its own passages that would seem to endorse violence. On the other hand, it too, is very emphatic about peace and religion not being something that should be compulsorily, but rather something accepted through voluntarism. And she marches through a kind of history. It's not as complete as you might want, but that takes you from the time when the Prophet first went to Mecca and as a merchant, essentially, and dying later, and the religion beginning, all the way through the 14th century, where the Muslims were kicked out of Spain along with the Jews, and alludes to something that scholars in the meantime have really found very. I have to turn this thing off here real quickly. I'm getting somebody texting me. I'm so sorry. Oh, here we go. I'm so sorry. I lost track of the window. My fault. The 7 centuries in which the Muslims ruled Spain, bringing about the La Convivencia, which is the great period of tolerance, the coexistence of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity in Spain in the Middle Ages. What resulted was really the first modern society, the first society that showed some of the glimmers of the ancient world's beauties, but revived. A place like Cordoba in the 9th and 10th centuries, under Islamic rule, became the most civilized place in the world, with the world's largest libraries, having rescued countless texts from the ancient world, eventually bringing them to Christians. So by the time St. Thomas Aquinas writes Summa Theologica, he's able to have access to all the writings of Aristotle, the philosopher, thanks to the preservation made by Islam. It wasn't Christians who did this, or Jews. It was Islam. And Islam, in that great period, its greatest period in history, gave us all sorts of technology, from a revival of plumbing. There were more bathhouses in Cordoba than in the rest of the world. Algebra, improving mathematics, surgery and medicine, astronomy, architecture, merchant craft. I mean, so many beautiful contributions by Islam to the world. So many of our words today come from Arabic origins because of this great period of so-called convivencia during the 7 centuries in which Islam ruled with a tolerant outlook towards Christians and Jews in Spain. This was a period in which, of course, equal rights, for all people were unknown in this period. But on the other hand, Christians were allowed to pay a tax. Christians and Jews were allowed to pay a small tax, nothing like today's taxations, but just a small fee, and be fully tolerated and otherwise completely left alone and protected by Islam. So, I mean, we have in real history a period of 7 centuries in which Islam gave birth to beautiful modern institutions of government. Now, to be sure, Islam learned from Christianity. Christianity learned from Islam. Judaism learned from Christianity, and Islam, and all three religions emerge out of medieval Spain, different from the way they went into it over the course of 7 centuries, until a new period of intolerance rose up. Now, she has her own explanations for the decline of Islam, and I think it's interesting. She says that failing of Islam was that in a way it's that it's too anarchist, that it tended to rule by tradition, and its rules were hardly ever codified in print or put into forms of constitutions and laws that everybody could see and obey, but rather just trusted the tribal traditions to too great an extent. In a sense, what she says is that Islam is actually too anarchist. And so later societies coming in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, coming out of the West, which were advancing beyond what Spain was able to achieve in those years, eventually put Islam in the shadows because Islam was unable to keep up and modernize itself according to modern standards. There are also plenty of scholars that draw attention to changing trade routes. So essentially, it was the advent of modern capitalism that changed the fate of Islam in the modern period, starting in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And then, of course, you get to the 20th century, and you see that Islam's wedded to very much of an old world way of looking at things, and not modernized at least many portions of Islam. Now, let me be clear, and I'm getting this from Mustafa Ayao, whose great book, Islam Without Extremes, I really love and I highly recommend to you. By the way, if you want to look at the history of Cordoba, have a look at a beautiful book called, gosh, I'm now suddenly misremembering the name of it. Let me see if I can just quickly look that up. Yeah, let me just quickly look this up. I don't want to leave you without. Well, I'll look it up later. See if I can find the name of it. I'm trying to look at my Google history to find the exact name and the author. So you can see this. Actually, hold on one quick second. Ornament of the World. Here we go. Yeah, this is the book I recommend to you. It's called Ornament of the World: How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. The author is Maria Rosa Menocal, Menocal. Ornament of the World. It's a wonderful book I read some years ago. Very impressive. It gives a picture of a history I didn't know anything about. So if your impression of Islam is entirely, sort of post 9/11 oriented, it's good to reread this because it will broaden your views a little bit. Now, I'm not trying to make a case for Islam, but just to say that there are many iterations of Islam, as there are many iterations of Christianity. So just check yourself as you're thinking through this. I mean, think about Christianity. There's so many different versions of this. We've got the sort of the Amish version, Mennonite version, the Quakers version with the pacifism, compared to the the Roman version of the Middle Ages, where imperial conquests and militarism and military orders and knights and and imperial explorations and suppressing, native religions and all the rest of it, was part of Christian ideology or in American history. I mean, all kinds of Christianities have lived alongside each other all throughout the 19th century. The teachings of St. Paul were used to justify slavery. In the Middle Ages, the anti-Semitism was justified according to the account of the crucifixion, as you read in the Gospels. Even in more recent years, you'll see Christianity rendered as being a warlike doctrine, and passages from the Hebrew Scriptures cited, or passages from the New Testament cited in defense of imperial wars and conquests. And this is again and the radically pacifistic. So I'm not saying which one's right, only to say that religion tend to be adaptive, and governments are hugely aware of this. Whatever the justification, whatever the needs of the state are at the moment, it will draw on the prevailing attitudes of the population, as a sort of organic firmament of people's beliefs, and say, see, if you're serious about Islam, if you're serious about Christianity, if you're serious about Judaism, whatever it happens to be, then you need to do the following thing: go to war, take arms against the infidel, defend yourself against the barbarian conquerors, or defend yourself against the heretics from abroad who are essentially incompatible with us. And religion becomes a kind of a tool of the state in that sense. And religions like Judaism, Islam, and Christianity tend to be extremely flexible in that way. Large-scale books, huge traditions, you can find what you want in them to justify things, maybe illegitimately. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, because that's just not the subject of my talk, but just to say that any religion can be used by powerful, violent people as a justification. And that's essentially what we have going on with Islam. It's the same thing in Christianity as you see in Islam. So it's impossible to talk about the radicalization of Islam without reference to the foreign policy of the U.S. in the last 15 years to sort of, to fuel this frenzy, this Islamic fundamentalist fire. Starting, of course, in the 1980s with the Reagan Doctrine in Afghanistan. So returning to the beginning of my talk here, U.S. is funding the Mujahideen. Oh, isn't this glorious? They hate the Soviets. The Soviets will never be able to stand up with them. They go guerrilla war tactics. Let's give them weapons, anti-aircraft weaponry, all the most modern equipment that U.S. military contractors could manufacture, shipped over to Afghanistan, eventually defeating the Soviets. And it wasn't just weaponry. It was all sorts of tactical support. U.S. funds used American taxpayers' dollars to build large-scale underground hideouts for the Mujahideen, to give them every kind of logistical support you can possibly imagine to defeat the Soviets. Well, out of this situation comes a new ruling class after the Soviets leave. The Mujahideen becomes the Taliban. Suddenly we've got another problem. Now this radicalized Taliban, coming out of a warlike situation, highly trained for killing, a thirst for blood, a desire for top-down military rule, a warrior spirit instilled in them. I mean, we see this in the U.S. Every time the U.S. gets in a war, and then peace comes. Now we've got a problem. We've got generals, we've got bond dealers, we've got military manufacturers, we've got everybody who benefited from the war is now a new elite class, and they're not about to let go of power. They're going to stick with power and try to impose it post-war. And so it was in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen becomes the Taliban. Well, the Taliban begins to wreak havoc all over Afghanistan. U.S. turns against the Taliban. 9/11 comes, U.S. invades Afghanistan, under the presumption that Afghanistan has become a hotbed of radical anti-U.S. radicalism. Oh, big surprise, and shows up, overthrows the Taliban. Taliban goes to the hills, and all these years later, we're still fighting Afghanistan. Longer than the Soviet conflict ever happened. I mean, it's remarkable for me because my political formation came out of a kind of moral disgust at what the Soviets were doing in Afghanistan. How could they do this? So, a land so far from Russia, attempting to impose rule on these people who just want to be left alone. And now, to see the U.S. repeating this error, not just repeating it, but going many stages beyond what the Soviets ever attempted to do in Afghanistan, with an endless doubling down as a way of imposing imperial rule. I mean, wow, talk about not learning from history, right? And coupled with that, of course, we had the extraordinary situation in Iraq, where you have many tribes, living more or less peacefully, but under the thumb of a despot who had finagled Iraqi industry and a way of getting all the appropriate payoffs to and delegate between all the groups competing in Iraq. And the result was something approaching or beginning towards being a liberal civilization. Iraq in the 1980s actually had an emigration problem. In other words, they had people from all over the region want to move there to play in their symphonies, to attend the universities, to women were given the right to drive. You can drink there. They're approaching a liberal society, in contrast to something like Saudi Arabia, which is still ruled in the most reactionary way with a despotic regime, thanks mainly to oil revenue, which saved essentially the worst elements of Islam from itself. So the U.S. goes in and overthrows. First of all, there's the invasion. What was that, 1991 or something like that? And Saddam Hussein's feet are held to the fire. Oh, you're building weapons of mass destruction. You've got to open up your country to inspectors, harming Saddam Hussein's sense of national pride, and so on. And bombings taking place over the period of a decade, eventually resulting after 9/11 in another invasion, even though everybody knew that Iraq had nothing whatsoever to do with the fall of the Twin Towers and the attacks, the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Nonetheless, it was a good excuse. Let's finally go after our long-time enemy, Saddam Hussein, who was eventually captured and killed. And I know some people in this period after the initial second Iraqi invasion after 9/11, who went as American advisors thinking that they were going to impose a kind of democratic constitutional regime on this country. And they attempted to do so, and I think probably sincerely, and it just boggles the mind, actually, in retrospect, to think that this ever happened. It wasn't too long before they were run out, and leaving behind Shiites in charge of the country, oppressing the Sunnis, and imposing Sharia law and reverting Iraq, now war-torn Iraq, to a kind of a primitive state. So you have, the Islamic radicalism being fueled and promoted and inspired as a blowback in Iraq. You had the same thing happening in Afghanistan, where things are getting ever more intense. And then it wasn't too long ago, I guess, what was it, 2 years ago or something like that, U.S. went into Libya and overthrew Gaddafi, a similar figure to Saddam Hussein, and then started agitating in Syria for another revolution there. Always thinking that if we get rid of one despot, the results will be freedom, Instead, what we get is a radicalized minority people that are desperate to wage war in a vengeful war against the conquerors in the name of Islam. So that's the background, that's the history, and that's why, and it's convoluted and crazy, but it's why we can look at this. That's why there's so much propaganda today. We've always been at war with Islam. And Americans are just incredibly naive, as are most Western peoples, just unaware of dynamics of invasion, oppression, and blowback around the world. I mean, most Americans have very little understanding or concern about U.S. empire and its implications abroad. If you're a reader of antiwar.com, or you like to read books on foreign policy, or even if you pick up the foreign policy pages of the newspaper, which hardly anybody does, the American bourgeoisie, 9/11 might have come as like this incredible shock. It's like we're all sitting around minding our business, having our barbecues, watching our Sunday football, raising our families and worshiping our God. And just out of nowhere, a bunch of crazy, swarthy, violent fanatics are trying to tear down our civilization. They hate us because of our freedom. And Americans bought it. It was one of the great shocks to me after 9/11. My first thought was, just to confess how politically naive I tend to be, was to think, wow, now at long last, Americans will see the price of empire. This is an egregious crime. It's horrible and horrendous, and yet people will now look and say, what kinds of things has the U.S. been doing abroad that would have inspired of hatred, that would cause people to sign up for these kinds of causes, where they give their own lives in order to overthrow. Is it that's bringing this about? And I really thought that the result would be an inspiration to peace, that the upshot of 9/11 would be that Americans would say, okay, we've been taking a very strange course over the previous decade. Let's try a different tack, because we're going the wrong direction here. Of course, that didn't happen. It was exactly the opposite. So here we are now, 25 years after the end of the Cold War, 40 years after World War II. We had an enemy, communism, Russia, and freedom had to be put on hold. At the end of the Cold War, a long period of searching around for the new enemy happened. Well, the U.S. foreign policy manages to create this out of the remnants of the Reagan Doctrine in the 1980s, and it's this unbelievable, monstrous, region-wide, violent force that we call ISIS. Paris bombings. There isn't a single American who didn't look at that Paris situation and say, that could be my town. We have to do something about this. And indeed, it could be your town. That is not an irrational fear. But all I'm urging here is, in light of Roosevelt Atlanta's account of the rise of Islam as making an immense contribution to human freedom, is whatever your views of foreign policy are, whatever your views towards U.S. relations with Syria, is Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, think before you start dragging religion into this. Don't be so easily manipulated, so that you repeat the great line, we've always been at war with Islam. My friends, it's not true. We owe Islam in the West so much. If you're reading Aristotle, you're quoting Aristotle. You're a Catholic, you love St. Thomas Aquinas. If you're a mathematician, you love numbers. If you love astrology, you love technology. All of these things are gifts that Islam brought the world. What I see when I look at the history of the West is no one religion can do it on its own, and no one peoples can do it on its own, and no one government. no one region. The world is a consequence of crowdsourcing, and every tradition makes its contributions. That's why we believe in religious tolerance and freedom for all people, because that's the best hope we have for building a beautiful civilization. Let's not disparage Islam as a faith. It's one thing in the Cold War to disparage communism, right? I mean, this is a wicked ideology that sought to abolish private property and the family, and get rid of all religion. Okay, so that's an easy problem. Whether the Soviet Union actually represented anything remotely like that is another question. I mean, arguably after Stalin, it just became a nationalist, bureaucratic, centrally planned state. And not ruling in the name of communism, just like the Chinese today, but not actually representing communism. But that I could see demonizing. To do Islam, to go there to show that, to suggest you're being manipulated by very, very powerful people who understand that the masses need a sample and conception of the world, good guys and bad guys. And so there it is. All these years later, in the 1980s, it was Islam. We've always been united with Islam against the evil forces of secular liberalism that are trying to destroy the world. Let us join our brothers, our people who are very similarly people of the book, people who respect God and tradition and family in the great struggle of our times. Now, here we are, 2015, and the struggle is different. Now we're told that Christianity has always been at war with Islam. Christianity believes in peace. Christianity believes in civilization and democracy. Whereas these people, these horrible, strange, wicked foreigners, they're wedded to tyranny. They're willing to sacrifice their lives for their fake God. They worship violence as a means, unlike us, and so on and so on. All I'm saying is, be aware. Take notice of when you're being manipulated. When the priorities of the state change, the cultural ethos begins to change, and people prove themselves remarkably adaptable. I mean, almost to a frightening extent. Islam is not an inherently violent religion any more than Christianity or Judaism is an inherently violent religion. Violent people will use a prevailing faith to justify whatever it is they will do. And you're playing into the hands of Islamic extremists, and re-rendering the current state of the world in these Manichaean terms. Christian West is the light, the dark and scary Islamic East, is the danger, is the problem. It's not true. And in fact, part of me can't even believe that I just had to give this hour-long talk on the subject, because as I say, within my own lifetime, it's been exactly the opposite. The line changes. We live in an Orwellian world. We do. But you don't have to. One way out of this is to consider the chapter in Rose Wilder Lane's book, The Discovery of Freedom, as a corrective to your own understanding of Islam and its history. And if it's not that book, then I would encourage you to read Ornament of the World or Mustafa Ayal's Islam Without Extremes, so that you won't be manipulated, so you won't be tied down according to these crazy political priorities. Well, thank you so much for spending the evening with me. Our hour went by so quick. I didn't expect it to happen like this. Thank you for being a member of Liberty.me. I hope you had a happy Thanksgiving, and you look forward to a beautiful Christmas and holidays in the future. This is a wonderful time for remembering what really matters, which is your own personal freedom and those you love, and for finding joy in spontaneous exercises of liberty and generosity that build up civilization. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. Take care, my friends.